today to be invoking the rule of experts without further qualification after COVID, it just, you got to read the room, right? Reading the room means acknowledging the loss of legitimacy that experts have recently faced. Hi, everybody. So many of you may have seen the recent debate between Rogan-Murray, Dave Smith, and Joe Rogan, on the Joe Rogan podcast about, I guess it was about many things, about Israel, about the coverage of Israel, but also from the clip that I saw. So keep in mind, I didn't see the whole program. I actually saw only a small part of it, but it was enough for us to have something to discuss here. Who should be allowed to speak, and what responsibility does Joe Rogan have for the guests he brings on? Are the guests that he brings on, actually historians? Should you be getting their opinion? I thought they were mainly comedians or something else, and they themselves say they're not experts. So why, Rogan-Murray was asking, are you, Joe Rogan, talking to these non-experts about a topic that's so important? Why don't you actually talk to people who know they know, who say they know, and whose business it is to know? So I think that's been a interesting public debate around that point. And again, keeping in mind here, just so we're on the same page, it's really only a small part of the interview that I saw and that I want to discuss in relationship to this topic. So let's look at it, okay? Because actually the topic of experts and their expertise, especially as concerns opinions about political life, is a very old one. In fact, I would say that in some sense, it's the key to classical political philosophy, to Plato and Socrates. And you might say, well, that's kind of unusual. But if you think about it, Socrates was killed. He was found guilty of committing certain capital offenses and forced to drink poison. Okay, Socrates was killed in part because he went around having conversations with so-called experts about the nature of their expertise. And he was able to see that and to show that they don't know the things they think they know. This had the effect of embarrassing them, of making them angry, and of undermining their authority, especially in the eyes of their followers. And, nobody likes to be publicly embarrassed. Nobody likes to be publicly undermined, to lose their authority like this. Unless, of course, they're keenly interested in the pursuit of truth, in which case Socrates showing them that they don't know what they think they know would be a great gift, because then they can look together for what it is that they want to know. In other words, they could philosophize together. But that's not what happened. Okay, so Socrates has conversations with people about the nature of their expertise, and he sees different groups of people have different kinds of claims to expertise that fall short in different sorts of ways. So let's just take this at a very simple level. Even the simple level has ifs, ands, and buts naturally, but let's take a pretty simple thing, okay? Let's say your tooth hurts. Your tooth hurts. And you feel like you should go to a doctor to deal with your tooth pain. So now, you could go to somebody who has no expertise, in other words, just a random stranger. You could go to somebody who possesses expertise of some kind, but, not of that kind. Or you can go to someone whose business it is to deal with teeth and with tooth pain. So let's call that a dentist. Okay, a dentist is a person whose business it is to deal with all of the things concerning teeth. So you wouldn't necessarily go to your chiropractor, I would assume, for a toothache, right? You'd go to your dentist. And that does not mean that dentists don't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that there are not unscrupulous dentists who take advantage, or people who went through dental school but actually never developed the expertise. They just faked their way through, or they bought a degree or whatever, right? You can imagine many different, like I said, ifs, ands, or buts about this example. But somehow, strictly speaking, if there is such a thing as dentistry, in other words, there is a knowledge concerning the teeth, then if you had a problem with your teeth, you'd want to go to the person who possesses that knowledge. And, in our system, there's like recognition, there's credentials, there's reviews. There are different ways that you can sort of make yourself more or less confident that you're trusting someone who does possess the art of dentistry or the know-how of dentistry or the expertise concerning dentistry. Okay, same with your car, right? If your car stops working, you are not going to take it to somebody whose job it is to appraise paintings, because that just doesn't make any sense. You're going to take it to someone whose job it is to repair cars. And again, are there unscrupulous mechanics? Yes, obviously, okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not everybody who has the outward showing of expertise, like they have a shop and they have a diploma and they have great marketing, actually possesses the expertise. People can dissemble, they can lie, they can seem to be experts, but not actually be experts, that sort of thing. So, but nevertheless, right, if there is such a thing as a knowledge concerning the functioning of cars and their parts, then if you're dealing with a certain problem, you want to take it to the person who possesses that expertise. So now what about history? Is history and the study of history, are disputes over morality and justice, are these kinds of, let's call them more broadly speaking, political notions and concepts, are they the same as the art of taking care of teeth and the art of taking care of cars? In other words, we assume that even if this person's lying and this person's not, there is such a thing as dental expertise. And that if this mechanic is honest and this one is dishonest, nevertheless, there is such a thing as expertise concerning automobiles. So is there such a thing as expertise concerning history? I mean, that's one question that this debate actually brings to the surface that you may not have thought about, right? Is there such a thing as expertise in the same way as there is in these other domains? Expertise concerning history, concerning morality, concerning justice. Is there an art, a science, or a knowledge for those things? Or is it just a matter of people's opinions and somehow irresolvable opinions, irresolvable disagreements over those opinions? Okay, so that's one thing I wanted you to think about that, is it's not self-evident, right? Like, what would it mean to be an expert? Let's say you're an expert in a certain, well, okay, fine. I'm an expert in such and such an historical period. And in what does my expertise consist, for example, right? I've consulted all of the relevant documents. Okay, I've interviewed all of the relevant people. I have studied all of the relevant similar and dissimilar historical examples. Maybe an expert in a historical topic is very well aware of the debates in the field, and has assessed those debates and all of their nuance on their merits using the historical sources. Okay, so all of that could be the case if you think about what constitutes historical expertise. By the way, I should say here, I'm neither defending nor am I criticizing Dave Smith or Douglas Murray. In the short clip that I saw, I would say that if I charitably reconstruct their arguments, Douglas Murray was saying that the general opinion, the general post-war moral consensus that Hitler was the bad guy and Nazism is wrong, and somehow Jews in Israel should be treated with special protective cover, because if we don't get our firmly established moral categories, so deeply ingrained and we veer from them, then what's going to happen is a lot of things that we've tried to suppress are going to come back up to the surface. And we suppress them for a good reason. It's not good when they come back up to the surface. And that public commentators like Joe Rogan and Dave Smith, they have a responsibility not only to say what they think is true and all of that, but actually to recognize, well, look, are you liberating something that has been suppressed without the full knowledge of what you're doing, or maybe even with the full knowledge of what you're doing, which arguably is worse? And, you have to have a sense of responsibility. And the only way you can carry a sense of responsibility is if you don't distance yourself from what it is that you're doing. So if you say, hey, I'm going to talk about Hitler, the Nazis, and the Second World War, but I'm not an expert, I'm just a person with opinions. What you're doing is you're speaking about something that requires a high degree of responsibility, but you are absolving yourself of that responsibility by declining to take on, the title or something like that of an expert, or, somebody who knows what it is that they're talking about through and through. So in other words, his main concern is with the moral effect, I guess, the moral/political effect of undoing certain post-war consensus about, good, bad, right, wrong, just, unjust, good guy, bad guy, and all of that, in a way that clearly does concern Israel and the Jews. Maybe first and foremost, I don't know Douglas Murray well enough to say for sure, but clearly in a very important way. So I think there's actually, a degree of truth in what Douglas Murray is saying there. When you change the mainstream moral opinion, you are engaged in a certain sort of social revolution. It seems that all political communities everywhere and at all times suppress certain perspectives in order to fashion their own identity, and also in order sort of to take a stand on basic moral questions. And so when those when those questions come up to the surface again, it's kind of like a crisis moment or a revolutionary moment, or a sort of regime of thought change, which comes with all kinds of consequences. So I agree with him that it's a big change, and you have to have some sense of responsibility for what you think and what you say. Okay, now Dave Smith makes the very reasonable point that, well, you should be allowed to think through an issue publicly, and you should be allowed to have an opinion about it, even if you're not a quote unquote expert, right? But what constitutes the expertise of the historical experts? Is it that they got their PhD from Yale or Harvard or somewhere else? But even among PhDs from Yale and Harvard, there are big disagreements over basic questions. So, obviously that doesn't settle the issue. Also, the people that we've called experts have recently, like for example, COVID or the Iraq War, apparently made such catastrophic miscalculations that everyone was affected by them. So if everyone is affected by the opinions of the quote unquote experts, then shouldn't everyone be allowed to challenge those opinions, to think about them, to assess them in their own way, to raise counterexamples and to sort of doubt that everything that's been suppressed is for their own good? In other words, experts have lost a lot of prestige, a lot of authority, and a lot of legitimacy recently. And therefore, it's kind of preposterous to say that only they should be allowed to publicly voice political opinions. Okay, so there are many reasons why Dave Smith's argument against Douglas Murray's invocation of the experts is compelling. Okay, but I would say that there's another element of the question, not just Dave Smith versus Douglas Murray, but again, sort of what is the nature of expertise? Why do we recognize that there's expertise in certain fields? What makes the fields of history, society, politics, morality different? And the reason I think that's interesting is because these are questions that occur in Plato's Republic, which is right there above my finger. Okay, Plato's Republic. So it shows you that these are not just questions for the 21st century, but they're questions for all time. Okay, well, anyways, those are just some preliminary things I wanted to say about the clips that I saw from this interview. I would say, the neoconservative kind of consensus has, again, I'm tempted to say it's broken down. I mean, clearly to some extent, it's broken down, right? You now have a right wing that is not first and foremost neoconservative. In other words, you have certain factions on the right that have broken from a neoconservative consensus. You can call them paleoconservative, you can call them whatever you want to call them, but they just don't see the world the way that the neoconservatives do. So, I've talked on this channel before about the factions on the right, and one of the ways of slicing and dicing that was to talk about the tech right and the trad right. I think another way is to talk about the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives, or again, whatever term you'd like to use to refer to these other groups. Clearly, the debate over the meaning of Israel for Western civilization, of the Jews for Western civilization, of the place of Judaism in the Western tradition. There are people who do not like the term Judeo-Christian, who say, no, there's no such thing as Judeo-Christian. There's Jewish and there's Christian, but there's no Judeo-Christian. There are Christians who say that, Jews who say that. Okay, but other people say, no, look, for the sake of fighting the enemies of the West, it is extremely important that we do not exacerbate the differences, and all the more so the hostilities, if there are any, between Jews and Christians, we must form a certain sort of united front against the enemies of the West. Okay, that's another very important perspective, proposal. So, yeah, these are all just things to pay attention to. I mean, the deep differences, the debates, the schisms, the contrasting worldviews and everything. You know, sometimes we just are fully members of one or another of the debating sides, which is fine. Probably you can't help but resonate more with one than with another. Okay, whether it's Dave Smith or Douglas Murray, whether it's Elon Musk or Steve Bannon, okay, whether it's whatever, name any figures who represent two sides of a debating team, and you probably feel inclined to one or the other. But there's also this other thing which I definitely encourage you to try to sift out and to try to tune into, which is there some way of formulating the underlying question here that gets us beyond, to some extent, the partiality of this side and that side, and helps us to understand sort of like a deeper dimension of the question. So again, like, should we trust experts? Yes, we should, because they know best. No, we shouldn't, because they've recently misled us, right? So there's a question, should we trust experts? There's a yes and a no. And there's sort of people who say like, yes, we should, no, we shouldn't. But the deeper question is, what is the nature of expertise in these various fields? Why is it obviously the case that we prefer to trust experts when it comes to certain matters, provided they are actually experts and not just play acting experts, you know, that they really possess expertise and haven't just learned how to fake the possession of expertise. Again, your teeth, your car, right? We gave those examples. Very clear. Surgery, right? Who do you want to have perform your surgery? Somebody who is an expert surgeon or somebody who is an amateur? And what is it about the things that most interest us in these public debates? Morality, justice, good, bad, right, wrong. That's a large part of it, right? The moral consensus, the prevailing opinion, the orthodoxy. You know, these things are a little bit different from, I can fix your car, I can fix your teeth, I can perform a surgery. So why is it? What is expertise? Who is an expert? And are there certain fields that are existentially of the greatest importance to us, but that nevertheless are not subject to expertise? And in that case, who do we prefer? If there is no such thing as a historical expert, then what? And Nietzsche has a piece of writing called The Use and Abuse of History for Life. You know, does history become something that is just used and abused? You know, dentistry is not used and abused, let's say, right? Auto mechanics is not used and abused. I mean, you see what I'm saying? Like, if there's no, properly speaking, expertise when it comes to these areas, then maybe all that there is the polemical employment of historical tropes for the purpose of elevating and suppressing certain groups. That's another perspective you can take. But again, it leads us to the question, what is historical expertise? What is history? What is moral? Who's the expert on morality? Are these things even subject to expert knowledge? So again, if you ever want to study those questions in the sort of most fundamental and foundational version, you have to study Plato, because that's where it all begins. But it's not like, unless you've studied Plato, you're not allowed to think about these things. Unless you've studied Plato, you're not allowed to talk about these things. No. Think it through, reason it through, puzzle it through, see which part of this question appeals the most to you. Put your finger on your own opinions. You know, why did you prefer? If you really thought Douglas Murray was right and Dave Smith was wrong, or Dave Smith was right, Douglas Murray was wrong, or in any other version of these debates, you can always stop and ask yourself, you know, why do I trust this person and not that person? By the way, I think Douglas Murray came off quite badly in the clips that I saw, condescending, pompous, arrogant, and today to be invoking the rule of experts without further qualification after COVID, it just, you know, you got to read the room, right? Reading the room means acknowledging the loss of legitimacy that experts have recently faced, right? And really, like, you got to get that. Otherwise, the conversation can't get off the ground. And it looks like it really didn't from the short clips that I saw from that interview. But ask yourselves, right? Who do you trust? Why do you trust them? Do you trust them because they possess a certain sort of knowledge? What's the nature of that knowledge? And then you're well on your way to philosophizing and not just opining. Okay, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this. It's been a long time since I made a video. I'm sorry, this year's been a strange year for me, but let's see if we can't get back into some sort of rhythm. I'm Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. Thanks for your time. Take care. Be well. Goodbye.